the secret Nazi fuel giant they didn't teach you about in school. Hydrierwerke Pölitz AG. Hidden in the forests and industrial landscape near today's Police, close to Szczecin, stood one of the most terrifying and technologically advanced fuel factories of the Third Reich, Hydrierwerke Pölitz AG. Between 1938 and 1945, this vast industrial monster turned hard coal, lignite, tar, and crude oil into aviation fuel and lubricants, feeding the war machine of Luftwaffe and helping keep Nazi military power alive. But this was not just a factory. It was a city of smoke, steel, fire, pressure, and death. It was a place where modern chemistry and engineering met slavery, brutality, fear, exhaustion, and mass suffering. A place where every drop of synthetic fuel came at a horrifying human cost. A place built not only on technology, but on the broken bodies of civilians, forced laborers, prisoners of war, and concentration camp inmates. And even today, despite documents, ruins, memories, and surviving traces scattered across the landscape, we still do not know everything. Some records were hidden, some were destroyed, some secrets vanished with the retreating Nazis. What remains is a chilling story that feels almost too dark, too complex, and too shocking to be real. This is the story of Hydrierwerke Pölitz AG, a factory that transformed the resources Germany had in abundance into the fuel it desperately needed for total war. A factory born from shortage, ambition, and war. Hydrierwerke Pölitz AG existed from 1938 to 1945 and was founded by the powerful German chemical conglomerate IG Farben, one of the industrial giants deeply tied to the Nazi regime and its war economy. In the western section of Hydrierwerke, another plant was built, Norddeutsche Mineralöl, a factory focused on lubricants and motor oils, launched in 1942. Together, these facilities formed an enormous industrial complex covering around 200 hectares. This was no ordinary refinery. Germany lacked enough natural petroleum to sustain its vast military ambitions, so it invested heavily in synthetic fuel production. Hydrierwerke Pölitz became one of the crucial answers to that problem. Here, engineers used the Burgess process, a demanding method that required extremely high temperatures and crushing pressure to convert coal and other feedstocks into valuable fuel. It was a brutal irony of war industry. From something Germany had in massive supply, coal, this factory produced aviation gasoline, one of the most strategically important resources for a mechanized war. Even byproducts and waste materials were reused. In that sense, viewed purely through the cold lens of industrial efficiency, this was a disturbingly modern concept. A plant where nothing was wasted, where every input, residue, and chemical stream had value. In a dark and unsettling comparison, one might say the complex resembled a 21st century factory, obsessed with waste utilization, recycling, and full resource recovery. Except it served a murderous dictatorship and was soaked in blood. Its efficiency was not humane, it was monstrous. The technology was advanced, the reality was hell. Hydrierwerke Pölitz was technically impressive, but morally horrifying. The machinery, pipes, towers, pressure systems, and chemical installations symbolized industrial modernity, yet the human reality beneath them was savage. This factory did not run on innovation alone. It ran on forced labor. To operate a complex of this scale, the Nazis brought in vast numbers of workers, civilian laborers, forced laborers, prisoners of war, and concentration camp inmates. They were housed in a network of camps surrounding the plant. Among them were Nordliger, Pommernliger, Wohnskiff Bremerhaven, Tabrigliger, Wollenweverliger, AEL Hedgerwell, and the KL Stutthof subcamp Pölitz. These names sound administrative, almost sterile, but behind them stood misery, hunger, disease, terror, and relentless exploitation. Thousands of people were trapped in a system of inhuman labor. They worked under crushing conditions, surrounded by toxic substances, deafening machines, smoke, and constant danger. They were underfed, overworked, humiliated, beaten, and treated as expendable tools rather than human beings. Many lived in permanent fear, fear of punishment, fear of selection, fear of collapse, fear of never seeing home again. This was not work in any normal sense. It was industrialized enslavement. The suffering was so immense that historians estimate around 13,000 people died during the Second World War as a result of hunger, disease, exhaustion, overwork, and the cruelty of their oppressors. Many of them were Poles. Their deaths were not accidental side effects of production. They were part of a system that considered entire groups of people disposable. Every section of the plant, every shipment, every barrel of fuel, every successful technical process depended on this hidden ocean of pain. The cruel paradox of the air raids. Hydrierwerke Pölitz was repeatedly bombed by Allied air forces until the very end of the war. As a strategic fuel installation, it was an obvious target. The bombings devastated the plant, shattered installations, and turned large sections of the complex into ruin. But for many forced laborers and prisoners, the air raids carried a bitter, heartbreaking paradox. The bombs brought chaos, and chaos brought a chance to run. During the confusion caused by bombing raids, some workers managed to escape from the factory complex, hopping against all odds to return to their homes, their families, and their former lives. In those desperate moments, amid smoke, fire, screaming sirens, collapsing structures, and total panic, people saw a narrow opening in the machinery of terror. For them, an air raid was not only destruction. It was hope. Yet that hope was cruelly incomplete. Many forced laborers resented the Allies for one devastating reason. Administrative buildings containing personal records and data were not destroyed. The SS and Nazi authorities had kept meticulous documentation. Names, identities, labor assignments, origins, all carefully recorded. Because these records survived, SS personnel could track down escapees and bring them back. Had those administrative archives been wiped out in the bombing, many fugitives might have vanished into the collapsing chaos of the Reich. They might have reached safety. They might have returned to their loved ones for good. Instead, countless people who briefly tasted freedom were hunted, identified, and dragged back into captivity. That detail cuts especially deep because it shows how terror was not maintained by violence alone. It was maintained by paperwork, bureaucracy, filing systems, and obsessive documentation. Behind the barbed wire and the smoke stood clerks, lists, forms, reports, and records, cold administrative tools that became weapons. This is one of the most chilling truths about places like Hydrierwerke Pölitz. The machinery of oppression was both industrial and bureaucratic. A prisoner could survive the bombing, survive the fire, survive the escape, and still be captured again because their name remained in a surviving office file. A place of secrets, silences, and missing pieces. Even today, despite the scale of the site, surviving ruins, archival material, and witness memory, we still do not know everything about the factory. That uncertainty is deeply unsettling. The Nazis documented obsessively, but they also concealed strategically. As the war collapsed around them, some records were likely classified, hidden, deliberately destroyed, or evacuated. Other data may have disappeared in the chaos of retreat, Soviet takeover, or post-war dismantling. This means that despite the surviving evidence, the full story of Hydrierwerke Pölitz remains fragmented. There are still unanswered questions. How many stories were lost with the dead? How many names never made it into the surviving archives? How many acts of cruelty, resistance, sabotage, escape, punishment, and survival vanished with burned files and vanished witnesses? The idea that such an enormous and important industrial complex can still remain partly hidden tells us something disturbing. History is not always a complete record. Sometimes it survives in shards, in scars, in ruins, in silence. And sometimes the missing pieces are the most haunting of all. The industrial giant that fed the Luftwaffe. Hydrierwerke Pölitz was strategically vital because it helped produce the fuel needed for Nazi air power. Aviation, gasoline, and lubricants were critical for aircraft operations, and synthetic production became essential as Germany struggled with raw petroleum shortages. This was one of the grim miracles of wartime chemical engineering, converting less desirable or more accessible resources into high-value military fuel. Coal, lignite, tar, and petroleum derivatives entered a harsh chemical transformation process under intense conditions. The output helped sustain aircraft, engines, mobility, and combat logistics. From an industrial perspective, the factory represented astonishing organization and adaptation. It used what was available in large amounts and transformed it into what the regime lacked most. It used byproducts. It used residues. It extracted value again and again. Nothing was meant to be wasted. This ruthless efficiency is part of what makes the story so fascinating and so horrifying. Technological sophistication on its own is not moral progress. A highly efficient system can still be evil. A modern production philosophy can still serve barbarism. Hydrierwerke Pölitz is a perfect example of that contradiction. Not just ruins, a landscape soaked in memory. When people visit the remains of industrial sites today, they often see concrete, steel, tunnels, foundations, and overgrown relics. Some admire the scale. Others feel the eerie atmosphere. Some are fascinated by the engineering. But places like this are far more than abandoned structures. They are wounded landscapes. The ground around Hydrierwerke Pölitz absorbed not only chemicals, oil, dust, and debris, but also fear, despair, desperation, and death. Around the factory stood the camps, barracks, guard systems, transport routes, and administrative nodes of oppression. It was an entire ecosystem of forced production and human degradation. Walking through such a place today means standing where exhausted prisoners once stood. It means looking at ruins that may appear silent, but were once filled with roaring machinery, shouted orders, smoke, and human suffering. It means recognizing that industrial history is never only about structures. It is about the people trapped inside them. And in this case, many of those people never left. The end of the factory and the next chapter of silence. In April 1945, Soviet forces entered the heavily damaged complex. By then, Allied bombing had already left the factory shattered. What had once been a symbol of Nazi industrial ambition was now a wrecked and broken shell. But the story did not end there. Until 28 September 1946, the Soviets dismantled the plant, removing what could still be taken from the site. Like many strategic industrial installations in the aftermath of war, Hydrierwerke became part ruin, part resource, part spoil of victory. Later, in the 1960s and 1970s, military facilities were established in the area of the former ruins, including a fuel storage depot and repair construction installations. Then, from the early 1990s, the terrain became publicly accessible. That last transformation is remarkable. A place once guarded, exploited, bombed, dismantled, militarized, and hidden became open ground. A landscape where the past still lingers in concrete fragments and forgotten lines beneath the trees. Yet public access does not automatically mean public understanding. Many people pass such places without realizing what happened there. Others know only fragments. Some have heard the name but not the human cost. That is why telling this story matters. The modern-sounding factory with an inhuman core. One of the most striking things about Hydrierwerke Pölitz is how strangely modern parts of its industrial logic sound. Today, we praise systems that reduce waste, reuse byproducts, maximize efficiency, and recover value from every stream of material. In many industries, that is considered intelligent, responsible, and future-oriented. Hydrierwerke did something eerily similar in technical terms. It took abundant raw materials, transformed them into strategic fuel, reused side streams, and treated waste as useful input. In purely technological language, it can sound almost like an ultra-modern, forward-thinking industrial plant built around advanced processing, recycling logic, and total resource utilization. But that comparison only becomes meaningful when paired with the truth. Its efficiency was built inside a genocidal dictatorship and sustained by slave labor. So yes, one could describe it as a factory of the 21st century in terms of resource use and industrial concept. But morally, it belonged to one of the darkest chapters in human history. Its brilliance was poisoned. Its efficiency was merciless. Its modernity was monstrous. Why this story still matters today. Hydrierwerke Pölitz matters because it reveals several uncomfortable truths at once. First, it shows how war is sustained not only by soldiers and battles, but by industry, chemistry, logistics, and hidden labor systems. Second, it shows how advanced technology can be used in the service of barbarism. Third, it reminds us that bureaucracy, files, records, office buildings, data systems can become instruments of oppression just as deadly as weapons. And fourth, it proves that some of the most important stories of the Second World War are still not widely known. Not because they were unimportant, but because they happened in the shadows between military history, industrial history, and human tragedy. This is exactly the kind of history many people feel they were never truly taught in school. Not the polished, simplified version, not the comfortable summary, but the raw, complicated, morally disturbing reality. A history hidden in plain sight. Hydrierwerke Pölitz AG was more than a Nazi fuel factory. It was a symbol of how modern industry, scientific ambition, and totalitarian cruelty can fuse into something terrifyingly effective. It turned coal into aviation fuel. It reused waste. It wasted nothing. It served the Luftwaffe. It helped power war. It swallowed thousands of lives. It was repeatedly bombed, partly destroyed, entered by Soviet forces, dismantled, repurposed, and eventually opened to the public. Yet even now, much about it remains uncertain, fragmented, or lost. That is what makes it so compelling. This is not just a story about ruins. It is a story about forgotten people, stolen lives, industrial terror, war technology, and secrets buried under concrete, rust, and trees. A story about a place where chemistry created fuel, but the system consumed human beings. If you want to discover the kind of history they didn't teach in school, the hidden stories, dark ruins, forgotten wartime sites, and unsettling truths buried across landscapes most people pass without noticing, subscribe to Valdi Travel. Because some places are not just abandoned, they are still speaking.